I had to cover only 10 years in my last 50 minutes. I have to cover 20 years this time, so you'll forgive me if I'm a bit more telegraphic or if I speak more quickly. At the outset of the 1960s, little seemed to have changed from the previous decade. By 1960, Jewish immigration to America had virtually ended, and the native-born Jews dominated the times. They were bent on maintaining the cultural patterns and values of American acculturation, about which we have spoken last time, while at the same time consolidating the economic and social gains of the 1950s, as for the matter were most of the few 100,000 post-war immigrants. Most of these Jews identified strongly with America and sought to be integrated into it completely. Articles like Israel Knox's in Commentary magazine in November of 1946, asking, quote, "Is America exile or home?" were by now, in the 1960s, unthinkable. Rather, this was the period that Milton Gordon spoke of in his book of the same name, which was published during that decade, a period that he called assimilation in American life. By the beginning of the 60s, Rabbi William Rosenblum, speaking for many Jews of the time, could declare, quote, "What we Jews want is what others desire, just to be let alone to enjoy life, liberty, and happiness along with our neighbors." The Jewish request was nothing very different from what all other Americans wanted. And the evidence in 1960 was that Rabbi Rosenblum's wish would be granted. The mobility that had become the hallmark of immediate post-war period seemed no less vigorous at the start of the new decade. Jews would share in the economic prosperity, a 45% increase in GNP, the largest since the war, that would mark the decade of the 60s. If Jews stood out in any respect, it was through their increasing affluence and social success. Already by the late 50s, the median income in Jewish America was 30% above the total population. In places like New York, the gap was even greater. And I can say from here on in, Jewish median income will continue, at least through the rest of my lectures, to be above the rest of the white population in America. Moreover, social success was also reflected in their increased university attendance and rapid career advancement, both of which put them ahead of the average white American. American Jews saw the 60s open with a promise of steadily improving life in America then. Indeed, there were signs of Jews having reached new heights on the road to the top. Beginning in the 1960s, for example, Jews headed some of the most important branches of the federal government, including the Federal Reserve System and the Labor, Commerce, State, and Treasury departments, positions of political power unprecedented in their American history. By 1964, the Republicans had nominated a man for president whose father was a Jew and who, although raised as an Episcopalian, still carried his father's recognizably Jewish name, Goldwater. In fact, there was a joke at the time that if there ever was going to be a Jew who was running for president of the United States, he would be an Episcopalian. And in fact, that happened. And while the Jewish ascension to the zenith of corporate power and college presidencies would become much more impressive in the following decade, the first important steps in that ascent took place during the 1960s. There was the entry of Jews into some of the best colleges, into higher management positions in major corporations, and into the lifestyles and social classes from which the meritocracy, the meritocratic new leadership would emerge in the following decades. There was no longer a question that Jews had found their place in America. Indeed, the post-war years, right into the beginning of the 1960s, seemed very much a golden age for Jewish life here. But as it turned out, less and less of the life of American Jews was being derived from Jewish history, experience, culture, and religion, and more of it was derived from the current and existing realities of American culture, politics, and the general American religion. As Jews were becoming more and more American, as America was becoming more and more of the Jewish heritage, in a way they were becoming less and less Jewish. There were also differences between generations. In a way, as if to illustrate this trend, let me tell you a brief story that appeared in the New York Times, or at least that was reported on in the New York Times during the third week of January 1960. It reported that in affluent Stamford, Connecticut, a community on what was then the farthest reaches of the metropolitan New York suburban frontier, the congregation of Temple Sinai had, in response to a request from the First Presbyterian Church Couples Club, the church had asked, "What is it that you Jews do in your synagogue?" They wanted to witness a Jewish religious service. And so the Jews of Temple Sinai in Stamford agreed to hold their regular Friday evening service in the assembly hall of the church. This move came because nearby Temple Sinai was too small to accommodate the Presbyterians. These suburban Jewish neighbors were ready to open this last purely Jewish preserve up for examination in order to demonstrate to the Presbyterians and through the newspaper accounts to everyone who was interested that, as Arthur Hertzberg put it in his felicitous phrasing, in their very Jewishness, they were behaving like other Americans. In effect, there were differences, however, between generations. Differences between what the parents believed and what the young people would believe during the 60s. If the parents believed, the parents about whom we spoke a great deal last time, that the secret of a Jew living happily in America is to assimilate as soon as possible, but always to remember he's a Jew, in fact, we could add to be unable to forget it or to be obsessed with forgetting it, their children did not even have to try to forget that they were Jews. For this younger generation, interaction was, by the beginning of the 60s, naturally occurring across ethnic lines. It would break the physical and mental barriers separating Jews from other Americans. Among these youngsters, people who were coming of age during the 60s, people like myself, who were taking for granted their full-fledged participation in and identification with America, life in suburbia and beyond represented, as Milton Gordon observed, the real melting pot of American life. Increasingly, at least at the start of the 60s, young Jews in the suburban gilded ghettos did not act in ways that were noticeably different from the other suburbanites who were not Jewish. To them, school ties and friendships were increasingly more important than primordial tribal ties, religious identities, or even neighborhood relations. When Will Herberg, writing about the integration of the Jew in contemporary America, suggested that, quote, the authentic Jew lives on two levels, in this world of America, but never quite of it, never fully conformed or adjusted to the American world in which he lives. Although he was writing in 1961, he was no longer talking about the younger generations of America who would come of age during this decade and the next, who were born and bred in suburbia and in America. They believed that they were not only in America, but that they were part of America. Herberg's assertion of what constituted the authentic Jew notwithstanding, in the homogenized suburban world of the late 50s and early 60s, to which young Jews especially seemed to adjust quite well indeed, being distinctively Jewish was gradually becoming less important. In fact, these younger suburban American Jews felt particularly uncomfortable with anything that made them stand out as Jews, and would have found Herberg's definition of Jewish authenticity hard to accept. Because for all of their parents' edifice complex, that temple building we spoke about last time, and even their joining, even though they themselves attended the synagogue schools and had bar or bat mitzvahs, these young people coming of age in the 60s grew uncomfortable with, and often oblivious to, their Jewish identity the older they got. Bar or bat mitzvah was more often than not a celebration marking the end of one's active involvement with Judaism, rather than a time when it would begin in earnest, as the tradition had meant it to be. In a sense, reflecting this attitude, let me tell you about, and I hope no one is related to this person here, Judith Kerman in 1966, a junior at the University of Rochester, perhaps articulated the feelings of many of her generation when she described herself in print as what she called an embarrassed Jew. And she wrote as follows: "Jewish organizations," she explained, "so patently sectarian, quote, make me nervous. Moreover, because of this embarrassment and discomfort, she raised the old Jewish anxiety of dual loyalties and wondered, quote, am I a Jew before I am an American, or an American before I am a Jew?" Although she had no answer to this question, she admitted that 18 years after the founding of the Jewish state, she could not call herself a Zionist because, quote, when I am categorized as a Jew by strangers, even, especially, by other Jews, I become uncomfortable. At best, she was able to conclude, all that I can lay claim to, so far, is a sense of Jewish history as my own, a feeling of aesthetic comfort with the few religious ceremonies I do know, and a basic humanism. This, however, she admitted, was, quote, a very vague definition, more an emotional presentiment than a creed. To be sure, she added, she was not antipathetic toward Jewry, and even acknowledged, quote, I envy the sectarian Jew, I think she meant the Orthodox Jew, I envy the sectarian Jew because he at least knows who he is. But such envy did not lead to her expecting to be anything like him, for it was also accompanied by the realization that she was also, quote, embarrassed by the sectarian Jew. Judith Kerman and others like her, so much a product of the 50s and the coming of age in the 60s, were the prototypes of people who would in the years ahead become unaffiliated Jews, or, if they really became alienated from and not just embarrassed by obviously Jewish people, be among those who in the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey, about which I'll speak more next time, identified themselves when asked as Jewish. They said, yes, I was born Jewish, but my current religion is none. If Miss Kerman did remain affiliated with Jewish community, from her testimony in 1966, one might conclude that the kind of Jewishness she would be most comfortable with would be an Americanized version, one that did away with all the vestiges of sectarianism. She might join a local YMWHA, but use it for its health club and the swimming pool or for theater parties, ignoring its Jewish content programs. The synagogue where she was a member and which she would attend, although for the most part rarely, would likely be a Reform one where the prayers were in English and the style and content all emphasized the American experience. The charity she would give would probably go overwhelmingly to general causes like the United Fund rather than the UJA. Like most of her co-religionists, she would never have visited Israel. Her home would probably lack Jewish symbols, although she might have a small mezuzah on her door. At Christmas time, she might have a tree, or at least someone in her family might, but in a nod to Jewish heritage, she would also include a Hanukkah menorah. At Passover time, she might attend a Seder in which both Jews and non-Jews participated. It might not necessarily be on the Seder night, but she would have it sometime during Passover. Indeed, some of those non-Jews who attended her Passover would probably be relatives. And so that she would not be too embarrassed or uncomfortable at the Seder, and because of her inability to use the Hebrew she once learned but long ago forgot, her Seder, which was probably more a family dinner than a Jewish ritual meal, did allow for the reading of the Haggadah. She might occasionally wonder about the Orthodox Jews, especially the bearded and earlocked ones that she sometimes heard about, who seemed so committed to their tradition. Maybe she envied their naive faith, yet she would not really know much about them nor think about them very often. But all of this would come later, in maybe the 80s and the 90s. In 1966, Judith Kerman was simply an embarrassed Jew. What else was happening in 1966, or in the 1960s? Well, we spoke last time about the decline of anti-Semitism. If anti-Semitism began its decline in the 1950s, it really took off. I mean by that, the decline took off in the 1960s. In fact, In place of anti-Semitism, there arose what some called asemitism. And by asemitism is meant an indifference to or an unawareness of Jewish identity. Americans simply didn't notice Jews anymore. Jews had ceased to be so obvious that they were the subject of anti-Semitism. In fact, at the same time that this asemitism seems to have become dominant during the 60s, that is not to say that Jews themselves didn't retain anxieties about anti-Semitism, but by and large, those Jews who retained those anxieties were of the older generation, the parents, rather than the children. Many American Jews who retained those anxieties doubted their Americanism and security throughout the 50s. They shared those anxieties as parents. But, as we pointed out last time, neither McCarthyism or the Rosenberg case yielded an increase in anti-Semitism. There was a profound change. Some of this I talked about during the question and answer period last time. Let me just repeat very briefly some of the numbers. In 1946, 55% of Americans thought that, quote, Jews have too much power in the United States. Even in 1948, 53% of the Americans polled said that they would limit the number of Germans to enter the United States. But as you may recall, I pointed out that 60% said that they would limit the number of Jews to enter the United States. By 1962, the story had changed quite dramatically. In 1962, 1% of Gentiles considered Jews a national menace. 1%. Only 1% justified anti-Jewish discrimination in employment in 1962. 88% were in favor of unlimited college admission for Jews in 1962. 17% of Americans thought Jews had too much power, but that was a drop of 70% since 1946. In fact, in what was probably one of the best-known studies sponsored by the American Jewish Committee and published in 1966, a study called Jews in the Mind of America, the organizer, the editor of the volume of that study, Charles Stember, concluded, for most Jews today, bigotry and discrimination are felt to exist, if at all, at a far remove from the actual course of their lives. Now, sure, there were incidents of anti-Semitism, there always are, and there are anti-defamation organizations that count those, that live off counting those. But by and large, anti-Semitism was not a phenomenon that Jews experienced during the 60s. Some Jews even suggested in an article, for example, in 1962 in the New York Times, that anti-Semitism should not be considered a singularly Jewish concern. If it exists, it's an American problem. It's not a Jewish problem. So, if we recap the situation, at least in the first half of the 60s, in the 60s, as I'm sure many of you realize, were a watershed decade for Jews as well as America. The American Jewish theme song was not Hatikva, but God Bless America. Of course, a song written by Irving Berlin, a first-generation product of New York's Lower East Side. So here was a situation at the beginning of the 1960s. Diminished anti-Semitism, growing Jewish affluence and influence, and a real feeling of being in and of America, especially by the young Jews who were coming of age during the decade, many of whom had grown up in suburbia. For the parents' generation, this was all accompanied by a lingering anxiety, or at least disbelief, that it was all so easy, along with a conviction that even in their successful amalgamation into America, they, the parents, should somehow remember that they were Jews, although exactly what the substance of this memory was to be remained vague and at best sentimental. On the other hand, for their children who took their Americanism for granted and whose Jewish identity was either tinged with an embarrassment or more commonly lacking even the little substance that their parents had, the obvious question became, if we're not different, why should we stand apart? But this question was not just the child's inquiry. On the contrary, while the children of the post-war era might be more prone to ask it, many of their parents, especially those who had started families during the later years of the 50s, those younger parents during the 60s, as they saw how well they made it, they also began to lose their anxiety about being Jewish, and they also were beginning to harbor these same questions, although they might not express it as unreservedly as the children. By the middle of the decade, they too faced the same situation, where essentially they asked, why should I be Jewish? In the 50s then, as long as being a Jew did not make them distinguished from American, American Jews defined themselves by religion, even if they were not religious. In the 60s, they didn't have to do that anymore. And so in the 60s, we can essentially begin to talk about what Look magazine called in 1964, Look magazine with its large circulation still, spoke of the vanishing American Jews. And indeed, we do see the first signs of this phenomenon. The growth rate was down. The growth rate of Jewry was at 1.15% a year, a little over 1% a year, versus nearly 1.5% growth rate for the rest of America. Fertility was continuing to drop from 2.5 to 2.3 in the 60s, and it would drop even below replacement level in the 1970s. There was no more significant immigration to Jewish America in the 60s. And immigration has always been the single largest source of Jewish population growth in America. We have not grown, the Jewish community has not grown by virtue of its fertility. It has always grown when more Jews come from somewhere else. Well, that didn't happen any longer in the 1960s. And in a way, in answer to that question, why be Jewish, there was, of course, an explosion of intermarriage. Between 1965 and 1971, there was a 30% intermarriage rate. That is, 30% of the marriages that took place between 1965 and 71 were out marriages. While 94% of the Jews had married other Jews in the 50s, then only 84% of the Jews were married to other Jews in the 1960s, and the number would continue to drop. But at the same time, there was this vanishing side of American Jewry. There was also an awakening to Jewish identity and activity, that Jewish identity and activity was a choice. During the 60s, late 60s, and also during the 70s, campus life, Jewish campus life, took on new meaning. Chavurot were founded, kind of intimate, more active Jewish religious communities. Israel activity exploded. Orthodoxy became more visible than it had ever been before in American history. And American Jews even talked about Aliyah, going to Israel. What were the stimuli of this awakening? Well, there is an old Yiddish saying which says, Avias Christelzach azoyas Yidelzach, which means essentially what the Christians do, the Jews end up doing. And it seems to me that part of the explanation for that Jewish awakening in the 1960s has to do with changes that were going on in America. America would, by the end of the 60s, and even more so in the 70s, move from the melting pot ideal to what I like to call the salad bowl ideal. In the melting pot, everything disappears into one big goulash. But in the salad bowl, you can be a tomato, and you can be a cucumber, and you can be a radish, and you can be anything, and you all belong in the salad bowl. And what I'm obviously talking about is the rise of ethnicity. The black civil rights movement, which already we spoke about last time, the notion that not only white middle-class Protestants could be the dominant forces in America, that not only they owned America, emerged first with the black civil rights movement, later on with growing ethnicity. Of course, I'm speaking telegraphically. Within that horizon, one could be Jewish as well. A second important element, I think, of the Jewish awakening was the Heilman story. The Heilman story, which in a way served as a catalyst to remind people again to talk about the Holocaust and all that it meant. Heilman, as you recall, was captured in 1960, went to trial in 1961, a very public trial, and was executed in 1962. That raised all of those anxieties of the Holocaust and reminded people again of the fragility of Jewish culture and the importance of Jewish survival. And some responded to that. A third element, I think, was triumphalist orthodoxy. The recognition that this small group of people who everyone thought were going to disappear were becoming radically orthodox in their lifestyles and willing to be public in their orthodoxy. They were not disappearing. And when a group that everyone predicts will disappear does not, even if their numbers are small, they have a capacity to capture the imagination of the population, and to some extent, triumphalist orthodoxy did. And of course, 1967 war in Israel, and later the 73 war, and even to some extent in the early 70s, the anti-Israel or anti-Zionist resolution at the United Nations. These events made Jews aware of the Jewish option. It gave them an opportunity. It gave them an excuse. It made it reasonable for some of them to choose to be Jewish. And I suppose we should add one more element, and that is the coming of age of the baby boomers. The baby boomers in some way have really focused much of the history of post-war America simply because of their large numbers. And even though I pointed out last time that Jews did not participate in the boom as much as other white Americans, nevertheless, these boomers responded to the life of their parents and, like many adolescents, said, we choose something different. And some of those choices were to go in one direction, out towards the periphery, and others of those choices were to go closer to the core, to the center. And so we can say that as the decade ripened and a new one began, a kind of polarization took place. Began in the 60s and has continued since then. And the choice was not simply between complete inclusion in the American system on the one hand versus a desire for an inviolable separateness on the other. We're not talking about total assimilation versus orthodoxy. Those are not the two poles that emerged, I think. Rather, the choice were between two distinct types of Jewish expression in America. Sure, there were lots of Jews who assimilated, but they're not part of the story anymore. They're outside of the story. I'm now talking about the two kinds of Jewish expression that emerged after the 60s. One type, by far more numerous and dominant, whose pattern of life had been firmly established, I think, in the 50s and in the early 60s, were the vanishing Jews, for whom being both American and Jewish meant making their Jewish identity and involvement subordinate to their being American. They wanted to be Jewish, but it was subordinate. These people whose Jewish attachments were relatively minimalist were simply Jewish Americans, hyphenate, if you will. No different from other hyphenated Americans, like Irish Americans, Italian Americans, and the emphasis was on American. These Jewish Americans were taking advantage of the opportunities for individual mobility that the meritocratic society allowed. They absorbed American values as well as American culture patterns, and they left behind elements of Jewish life that set them firmly apart. Anything that made a Jew seem un-American, whether it was a different language or different clothes or different accent or different practices, had to go. As a result, the Jewish aspect of their hyphenate status became weakened. To be sure, they remained proud of their heritage. These were people who were not embarrassed to be Jewish. They were proud of their Jewishness, but what it meant to be Jewish was not quite what it had meant before. And it didn't lead to much Jewish activity. As Arthur A. Cohen described them in 1963, they were Jews who, quote, divested themselves of that which they considered most noticeable, provocative, and embarrassing, which meant relinquishing their distinctive Jewish beliefs, and even so, more so, reforming their behavior patterns, many of which were associated with other places, the city, the old country, and other times. So they'd have a Passover Seder of some sort, Hanukkah candles on at least some nights, maybe a stop into the synagogue a few times a year, or a bar bat mitzvah might be enough. For other Jews, it might be a general reverence for intellect, explained as the coming out of Jewish heritage. For still others, it might be a Jewish American liberality, a response to a collective awareness of national history of Jewish oppression. In effect, these were important new Jewish identities, but they were very different kind of Jewish identities from what had been there in the past. In fact, this association was substantiated in a Los Angeles Times nationwide survey of American Jews, in which half of those questioned asserted that a commitment to social equality was most important in their Jewish identity. There were probably even some, and I don't want to be misunderstood on this, but there were probably some American Jews, or Jewish Americans I should say, who considered a Sunday brunch of lox and bagels or a piece of herring at some gathering with other Jews to be sufficient to signal their Jewish heritage. In short, they had to have some sort of connection to Jewish life. Herbert Gans calls this symbolic ethnicity. You have an ethnicity, but it isn't something that takes up a lot of your time, attention, and energy. It's just a little, like a little lapel pin, a little Mogen David, a little Chai pin, a little lox and bagels, and it's enough. You don't want to give that up. And I don't want to minimize its importance to the people who held it. And this was, to these Jewish Americans, enough. They were so comfortable in America, and their anxieties about the potential disappearance of the Jews, as reported by Look magazine and the demographers, were not real, at least not in 1964. They weren't bothered by that article in 1964 because they really didn't believe that Jews in America were going to disappear. They weren't even upset about the quality of American Jewish life, nor did they consider themselves personally responsible for it. To them, everything was all right. In response to those who argued that more was necessary, they allowed themselves to assume if more is necessary, there's somebody out there who's doing it. The Orthodox are having kids, so don't worry about that. They're still building synagogues. They'll keep the flame burning, reflecting an attitude that gave diminished attention to group belongingness and greater importance to individualization. These Jews identified with their religious and ethnic group, but it was an identification that was voluntary, contingent, fluid, not given fixed or rigid. It shifted. While they cared about being identified as Jewish, this concern with identity could be expressed simply by stressing, we're not Christian. That was enough. If it's clear that we're not Christian, that's good enough. Every so often, it required some small infusion. But there were other Jews. For these others, it was not enough to remember and stress Judaism just at certain points of life. It was not enough to say, I was born Jewish, or I grew up as a Jew, that it's a matter of my background heritage. For another group of Jews, in America, where the new and the improved was always best and tomorrow was more important than yesterday, for them, heritage meant more than simply the symbolic ethnicity. These were the active and distinctive Jews who did go to the synagogue, who maintained the Jewish organizations, who were worried about the vanishing American Jew, or at least about the idea of it. The predictions of a precipitous demographic decline and rampant assimilation made these Jews wonder whether they would indeed be soon swallowed up by America and history. And while some of the Jewish heritage Jews were commemorating the Holocaust, the activist Jews were wondering how they would commemorate the disappearance of American Jewry, for which there would be no monuments because there would be no one to put those monuments up. They saw the openness of American life and society, which had made Judaism totally voluntary, as the key challenge and dilemma, and they were not at all certain how they could survive. When they saw these doubts trumpeted to the general non-Jewish public in the 1964 Look magazine, they were jolted deeply. And in addition to these two types of Jews, perhaps the most frightening part was the shrinking middle. What do I mean by the shrinking middle? The people, well, who were the middle? The content of the middle the middle level of Jewry might vary from community to community. But generally, it included in the ritual domain an obligatory attendance at the synagogue on the high holidays, a celebration of the Passover Seder that was more than simply a family meal, a consistent but not always strictly traditional celebration of major Jewish rites of passage, the lighting of Hanukkah candles, often as a way of publicly distinguishing themselves from those who celebrated Christmas in America. In the institutional domain, the middle-level people were affiliated with synagogues at the very least and sent their Jewish children to school, to Jewish schools, at least to some part-time Hebrew school. It included some support of the Jewish federations and the UJA, usually in some kind of donation. And finally, in the domain of civil Judaism, it came increasingly to include a commemoration of the Holocaust, along with a warning that it must never happen again, a support for political efforts that ensured the security of Israel, work on behalf of Soviet or other oppressed Jewries. These were partial but consistent attachments to Judaism. These kinds of people, who were not altogether orthodox, who were not always activist in their Judaism, but saw their Judaism as more than something that was simply background heritage. This middle level began to shrink. Why? Well, it's a long explanation, but let me boil it down to three major issues, three major explanations. In the polarization of Jewish life that began in the mid-60s and continued on in the 70s, to be actively Jewish began to require more. You had to do more if you wanted to be actively Jewish, and these people were not prepared to do that more. You had to spend more time in Jewish education. You had to be more active in political Jewish causes. You had to go to Israel, and so on and so forth, at least on a visit. The second was that the 1960s, as I'm sure many of you recall, was an era of polarization, where you were either on one side or the other. The middle didn't exist. The 60s was not a good time for moderation. And the third was that there was a certain comfort of Jewish heritage. You could get away with doing less. That hadn't been possible in the past. The 1975 National Opinion Research Council surveys of all Americans found that the most common religious switch that Americans made in the late 60s and into the middle 70s, the most common religious switch Americans made was not from one denomination to another, but most Americans switched from one religion to having no religion. And that's another part of this shrinking of the middle. Now, the middle didn't disappear. There are still middle-level Jews around. But it lost its permanence, and it seemed far more fluid. So, for example, just before I came here, I was in my local Y in the locker room, and I heard two men talking. It was just after Passover, and one said, well, did you have your Seder this year? And one guy said, yeah, I even had 3. How could you have 3? Well, I went to my son for the first, and I went to my daughter for the second, and my other son, they were going away for a skiing vacation, and they couldn't really have the Seder on Passover. So I said, Dad, would you mind if we had it on Sunday? And I said, sure, why not? So I had the third one on Sunday with them. And his buddy sitting next to him said, well, you know, we don't do it anymore. We did it when the kids were young, but now the kids are grown, so we don't really need to do it anymore because, you know, seders are kid stuff, and the kids are in California, and we're here in New York. So the seder was for kids, but when the kids were gone, no more seder. These were the middle-level Jews who there was no middle level for them. There were fewer opportunities for them to express Judaism, and occasions for getting involved with Judaism, when they did, tended to be more absorbing, as the so-called Baal Tshuva, or the return to Judaism movement, demonstrated. There were decreasing numbers then of middle-level Jews, and in fact, the middle-level Jews, who by and large had populated what for a long time had been the single largest Jewish movement or denomination in America, the conservative movement, began to shrink. And it is, by now, no longer the largest movement. In fact, there was a joke that was made at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the late 60s that, in a way, captures something about what this middle-level Judaism was going through. And the joke went something like this, that what was JTS, what was the Jewish Theological Seminary? It was an Orthodox seminary that turned out conservative rabbis who would have to minister to Reform Jews. Essentially, the seminary was the guardian, the bastion of traditional Judaism. The rabbis were activist Jews, but not ready to be Orthodox. And the congregations that they served, by and large, were already far less activist and involved than they were. The polarizations of the 60s also added to this. In a sense, the middle began not only to disappear, the middle was not any place to be in the 60s and into the 70s. The middle, with its moderation, was simply out of date. The movement between two types of Jews has allowed for some kind of fluidity in movement between them. These two types of Jews, which essentially have defined American Jewry since the 60s and 70s, do allow for movement between them. So, for example, some Jews who began activist, perhaps as the children of middle-level Jews, or saw themselves as activist, in time dropped out of it. A classic way of putting this might be, I was bar mitzvahed, but don't ask me what I did because I barely remember it. I went to Hebrew school, but I don't know it anymore. Hebrew school, in a sense, became the place that people remember as the school they went to where they did not learn Hebrew. On the other hand, there were Jews who, by and large, saw their heritage as background, as something minimal, as symbolic, who did suddenly find themselves getting involved. The Soviet Jewry rallies, which for many Jews became really a kind of stimulus for an activity and involvement that they had never had before. A Holocaust memorial, a Holocaust experience, which suddenly changed their lives. Jewish educational binges, the rise, as I'll talk about briefly, of the Jewish women's movement. A trip to Israel, for many of them, particularly after 1967, suddenly might have led to some greater Jewish activity. But as was the case, this polarization essentially remained. What about in Jewish education? We talked a lot about Jewish education last time. In Jewish education, by 1970, of those between the ages of 5 to 24, that is, those who were born after World War II, only between 40 to 60% of them were getting Jewish education. In 1946, almost 63% of Jewish school-aged children were in a 5-day-a-week Hebrew school. In 1958, 66% were in a 3-day-a-week Hebrew school, and only 6% were left going to 5-day-a-week Hebrew schools. In fact, in 1962, half of the population claimed to be going only 1 day a week. In 1970, there were no 5-day-a-week Hebrew schools left. In the 70s, 69% of Jewish children had a Jewish education between the grades of 5 and 7. 35% had a Jewish education in the grades between 8 and 10. and 12% had a Jewish education between the grades 11 and 12. So Hebrew school, more and more, was a part-time occupation. It led to an illiteracy of immense proportions among American Jewry during the 60s and 70s. And what was the implication of that? Not only Jewish illiteracy certainly came out of that. As I said, Hebrew school was the place where Hebrew wasn't learned. But we know something else, that extensive and intensive Jewish education is generally very highly correlated with Jewish in-marriage. If you don't have a lot of Jewish education, and you don't really know what the substance, what the character, what the meaning of being Jewish is, then when it comes time to marry, and you see how much you are like the rest of America, if your parents say, don't marry a Gentile, it doesn't make any sense. Why not? They are my friends. I go to school with them. They are my neighbors. I am like them. I share their values. They're nice people. Why not? And there was no answer. There was no worthwhile answer. On the other hand, the activist Jews were starting day schools and pleading for more. The day school movement took off during the 1960s. In 1960, there were 160 day schools. In 1961, there were 278 Torah Sora, that is Orthodox-sponsored day schools, and 1961 was the year that the conservative movement founded its Schechter day schools. In 1962, 8.5% of the Jewish education in America was coming out of day schools. In 1966, it was 14%, and the number continued to grow. It is still the case that overwhelmingly those who get a Jewish education in America go to supplementary schools and not to Jewish day schools. But Jewish day schools began to offer an alternative form of Jewish education, and the Jewish day school really was a revolutionary idea because, remember, this came after that period of assimilation, and what does a Jewish day school do? It may not give more Jewish education in terms of time than the 5-day-a-week Hebrew school did, but unlike the 5-day-a-week Hebrew school, the Jewish day school keeps you with Jewish children from the first class to the last. Secular and Jewish studies are carried on in essentially an insular environment. And although the Jewish day schools have changed and in fact recruit on the basis of that they get their students into the best colleges and professions, and don't say, well, come to our day school because most of our graduates keep the Sabbath, or most of our graduates eat kosher, or most of our graduates study Torah 3 times a week. That's not how they generally recruit. They recruit, our graduates go to Princeton and Harvard and Yale, and we have doctors and lawyers and so on. But nonetheless, the Jewish day school is an ideal, created an insular Jewish environment. If you think about the American Jews of the 50s and moving to that in the 60s, that's a fundamental change. What about secular education? Well, we know American Jews embraced that. 89% of the native-born Jews significantly exceeded their parents' education beginning in the 60s. By the late 60s and 70s, 80% were receiving a college education. In the 1970s, 25% Jews were going into the law, 23% were going into medicine. Leaving aside the implications of this for other elements, for example, with regard to contributions, and we'll talk more about that next time, just to give you a quick idea of this, a doctor doesn't gain reputation and status in the community by how much money he gives away. His status in the community, or her status in the community, is very much a product of their professions, and that has real implications for Jewish philanthropic organizations. In any event, Jews were becoming professionals. Jews were also becoming, by virtue of their becoming professionals, entering into an altogether different culture. This professionalization, this education, led to them feeling a greater solidarity with their profession than with tribal identity. For a Jew, now, what I do, even more so than the 50s, what I do became more important than who I am, or who I am was what I do. And of course, the late 60s and early 70s were the period of Jews and the counterculture, and this is so well known that I think I can really skim over the top of it. Essentially, what the counterculture did is it encouraged, it fostered the idea of shunning the parent's lifestyle. Shunning the parent's lifestyle really also helps account for this polarization. You either became more observant than your parents, or you didn't carry on with this nostalgic middle level of Jewish life that your parents had had. There was a greater solidarity with student culture than with family, tribe, or established religion. And we all remember the line, "Don't trust anyone over 30." Right? Now that I'm over 30, I trust everyone over 30. I don't trust anyone under 30. For Jewish Americans during this period, liberalism, universal causes, civil rights became really a kind of religion. Marching in Selma, being involved with voter registration, was a very important part of many Jewish Americans during the 1960s. For Jewish Jews, there was also a kind of counterculture, taking over Jewish organizations, militating for more chavurot, taking over for the federations. Perhaps the most clear indicator of what was happening to Jewish life in the 60s and 70s is Jewish charitable giving. You know, since the giving of the shekel in the Bible, giving money for Jews is a way of being counted. If you give to Jewish causes, it's a way of counting yourself among Jews. And one of the things that we find is that as Jews became more and more like Americans, they continued to give money, but no longer to Jewish causes. When you have made it in America, you don't give only to Jewish causes, to the synagogue, to the yeshiva, to the federation. Let me just give you some of the numbers. In 1960, although the economy was doing well, as we have seen, Jews raised only $128 million for the federations. This was down from the nearly $131 million of the previous year, a drop of 1.5%. The next year, the collection diminished twice as much, 3.5%, down to $124 million, and this is not accounting for inflation. And while the figure in 1962 was about the same, these collections then did not demonstrate the effects of inflation. In fact, it wasn't until '67 and the Six-Day War that the number of contributors and the level of giving began to rise again dramatically, as it did once before, and that was in 1946 after the Holocaust. After '67, it began its drop again, except with a blip during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. As my colleague Stephen Cohen notes, the 1965 nationwide total of Federation giving reached $131 million. In 1974, following the Yom Kippur War, that sum amounted to a record of $660 million. In 1975, however, the total amount raised plummeted from $660 million to $475 million. And it's remained at that level ever since, even though, as we all know, the inflation since 1975 has been much more. How do we account for this? Jews, of course, were no longer shopkeepers and business people. Exclusively or even overwhelmingly, they were highly involved in professions. And while in the past, it turns out that how much money you have determines how much you give to Jewish causes, the data demonstrates that now what determines how much you give to Jewish causes is not how much money you have, because Jews still have a lot of money. Now what determines whether or not you give to Jewish causes is how actively and intensively Jewish you are. And as Jews have become less actively Jewish, even though they make more money, they don't necessarily give it to Jewish organizations. I don't want to paint only the bleak picture. There were those who were young, active, Jewish, and ethnic. In 1971, for example, the World Union of Jewish Students had a conference that they defined, or they titled, Creative Jewing. And what they meant by creative Jewing was to reject the prevailing Jewish lifestyle, without rejecting Judaism or Jewish culture. There was campus activity that took off. Jewish studies programs began to explode during the 70s. Let me give you one example. In March 1969, some activists took over the Hillel National Conference, urging that Jews, quote, ban the country clubs and instead put the money into Jewish education. Like their Jewish American counterparts, they agreed that the only important thing is to revolutionize the establishment. And they were ready to start from scratch. But these Jewish activists said, our revolutionary activity is going to make the Jewish community in America more Jewish. And in fact, they did make significant inroads in Jewish campus life, in Jewish education. Campus activity, I think, reached really an apex of involvement during that period. In 1971, Ezrat Nashim was founded. Ezrat Nashim was, in fact, the first Jewish feminist movement. In 1972, the Rabbinical Assembly of the conservative movement was asked to change its sexist language in the Jewish prayer book. In 1972, the first woman rabbi was ordained, Sally Prisand. After that, not only did the Reform movement begin to ordain women, but so too did the conservative movement and the Reconstructionist movement. In 1973, a National Jewish Women's Conference led to, at least in 73, conservatives counting women in the minyan. This was a period of Jewish activism then, not only for the young, not only for the campuses, but essentially there was a population that began to become far more actively Jewish. And as they did, not only did they raise Jewish studies to importance that they never had had before. In 1966, there were 70 such programs, a sevenfold increase since 1946. There was solidarity among these Jewish activists of a sort not seen before. And yet, what was it like at the end of the 60s and the 70s? It was all right to be Jewish, and for some it meant a great deal of activity, but for most it meant background heritage and symbolic ethnicity. There was proactive Jewish sentiment among many. There was an element of American Jewry that wanted to revitalize both American Jewish religion and American Jewish life, whether that was among women or among some in the counterculture, on the campuses. But in spite of that activism, and in spite of the fact that important changes began to take place, particularly during the late 70s, it's fair to say that the activism of the activist Jews did not lead to a mass renaissance of Jewish involvement and identity. In fact, by the end of the 70s, there were two great strains of Jewish life, and they continued on their divergent paths. And the largest number was moving in the direction of simple Jewish heritage, symbolic ethnicity, symbolic Judaism, if you will. And the small group was becoming far more actively Jewish than ever before in American history. And so those who looked to the activists came out of the 60s and 70s with great hope and promise and said, these are the people who have to be supported. These are the people who will be writing Jewish history in America in the years ahead. But those who looked the other direction saw an altogether different story. And if we chose to forget about that different story, it would come back to haunt us during the next 2 decades. The good news then at the end of the 60s and 70s was that the actively Jewish Jews did not disappear. The bad news was that they remained an ever more obviously minority element in American Jewish life. The elites, the active Jewish Jews, were doing great, but there were so few of them and dropping. The other Jews thought they were doing great, but they weren't doing all that much. The results of all that would be the extraordinary changes that happened in the 1980s and 90s, what we might call the withering of American Jewry, And so next time I'll talk about Whither, American Jewry. Thank you very much.